"You should be more like Preston," my mother said, refilling his wine glass before anyone else is at the table. "He takes care of everything." My name is Renata, I'm 32, and I've spent 11 years training myself to recognize the exact architecture of control in other people's marriages, while somehow missing the shape of it sitting across the table from me every Sunday for the last 8 years. I'm a licensed trauma therapist. I specialize in coercive control, the slow, deliberate way abusers build walls around the people they claim to love, brick by brick, compliment by criticism, until the person inside can no longer tell which parts of the cage are theirs and which were built for them. I know the vocabulary. Darvo. Trauma bonding. Intermittent reinforcement. I've sat across from dozens of women and helped them name what was happening to them long before they were ready to leave. And for 8 years, I sat at my parents' dinner table and watched my sister Bianca flinch every time her husband's phone buzzed, and I told myself it was nothing, because naming it would have meant admitting what it would cost all of us to say out loud. My husband, Julian, sat beside me that night, quiet in the particular way he'd learned to be quiet at these dinners, a carpenter, good with his hands and his patience. 5 years into a marriage my parents had never quite forgiven him for not being something more impressive. My mother, Diane, and my father, Harold, had built their entire understanding of a successful marriage around Preston, Bianca's husband of 8 years, a rising partner track attorney at a downtown Portland firm, handsome in the specific, camera-ready way that made people trust him before he'd said a single word. "Julian built us that dining table you're sitting at," Bianca said quietly, trying, as she always did, to redirect the conversation somewhere kinder. 40 hours of work. You should see the joinery on the legs." "That's sweet," my mother said, in the tone she reserved for things she found charming rather than impressive. "Preston just closed a 12-property commercial commission for the Ashford Group. Do you know what the commission on that is? $3,000 just in the closing bonus he brought home last week." I watched Julian's jaw tighten, almost imperceptibly, and reached for his hand under the table. He squeezed back once, brief, a small private acknowledgement of a wound he'd stopped mentioning out loud years ago. "I want to tell you honestly what I noticed that night, because it matters to everything that came after." Bianca's phone buzzed twice during dinner, and both times, before she could even glance at it, Preston's hand moved casual, easy, almost affectionate, to rest over hers on the table, a gesture that looked like tenderness to everyone watching and felt. When I studied it with the part of my brain that studies exactly this kind of thing for a living, like something closer to a leash. She didn't check her phone either time. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself 11 years of professional pattern recognition had started bleeding into places it didn't belong, that not every married couple's small gestures were symptoms of something darker. I was wrong about that. I just didn't know how wrong yet. When Bianca reached for the wine bottle to refill her own glass, I noticed a bruise on the inside of her wrist, pale yellow-green, the color of something almost healed, peeking out from beneath the cuff of her sweater before she tugged the sleeve back down without seeming to think about it at all. I didn't say anything that night. I told myself it could have been anything, a fall, a cabinet door corner, the 100 small accidents that happen to anyone's body. I had spent my whole professional life teaching other people not to explain away what their eyes had already told them, and that night, at my own parents' table, I did exactly what I'd trained 100 women not to do. I looked away. Preston raised his glass that night, toasting 8 years of marriage to my sister with a warmth that made my mother's eyes go soft and my father nod along approvingly, and I sat there with my own wine untouched, watching my sister smile at a man whose hand had just closed, however gently, over hers to keep her from looking at whatever her phone wanted to tell her. I had no idea, driving home that night with Julian's hand resting on my knee, how close I already was to the edge of something I wouldn't be able to unsee. The weeks after that anniversary dinner had a strange, low-grade static to them, the kind of unease you can't quite locate but also can't quite dismiss, the sensation of a smoke detector chirping somewhere in a house you can't find the source of. Bianca called more than usual that month, which should have comforted me and instead unsettled me, because the calls themselves had changed shape. She used to talk for an hour about nothing, a new recipe, a work frustration, the small textured detail of an ordinary life. Now the calls were shorter, careful, punctuated by pauses that felt like she was listening for something on her end of the line that I couldn't hear on mine. "Everything okay?" I asked her during one of those calls, watching Julian sand down a table leg in our garage through the kitchen window, sawdust catching gold in the afternoon light. "Of course," she said, too quickly. "Just tired. Preston's been working late a lot, big case." I let it go. I want to be honest about that, because this is the part of the story where my own blind spot starts doing its quiet, patient work. I had built my entire adult identity around being the daughter who kept the peace, the one who smoothed things over at family dinners, who didn't push, who believed that if I just didn't rock the boat, everyone in it would stay safe. I told myself that protecting the family meant not confronting things directly. I didn't yet understand that I had confused peace with silence, and that silence, in a house where something was actually wrong, isn't peace at all. It's just quiet complicity wearing a nicer name. Something tightened in my chest every time Bianca deflected a question a little too smoothly, small and quick, gone before I let myself examine it. I told myself I was overanalyzing my own sister the way I overanalyzed clients, that not everyone's evasions were symptoms. At the next family dinner, 3 weeks later, I noticed Preston take Bianca's phone from her hand mid-conversation, not violently, not even unkindly, just a smooth, practiced motion, like he was helping her with something she hadn't asked for help with. "And set it face down on the counter so you can actually be present with us." Everyone at the table laughed. My mother said something about how thoughtful that was, how present Preston always kept the family. I laughed too. I hated myself a little for laughing, even in the moment. I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't notice. I noticed everything. That was my job. My entire professional life built around noticing exactly this kind of gesture in strangers, but because saying something out loud, in front of my parents, in front of Preston, felt like detonating something I wasn't ready to survive the aftermath of. Rachel, no, Monica, Bianca's coworker at the marketing firm where she worked part-time, someone I'd met a handful of times at company holiday parties, texted me out of nowhere that same week. "Hey, this might be nothing, but is everything okay with your sister?" She seemed really shaken after a call last week and wouldn't talk about it. I called Bianca immediately after reading that text, my heart doing something quick and uneven against my ribs. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice bright in a way that didn't match the tightness underneath it. "Monica said you seemed upset after a phone call last week," I said, trying to keep my voice light, professional, the voice I used with clients when I needed to open a door without slamming it. "Monica worries too much," Bianca said, laughing it off, a laugh with no real air behind it. It was nothing. Work stress. I recognized that laugh. I'd heard it in my office 100 times, coming from women describing things that were very much not nothing. I recognized it and still let it pass, because recognizing it in my sister meant admitting something about my family I wasn't ready to admit. If you've ever had a friend or family member give you an answer that technically closes the conversation, but somehow leaves the air in the room heavier than before, you understand exactly what that phone call felt like. I mentioned the bruise to Julian that night, finally, lying in the dark of our bedroom, the ceiling fan turning its slow circle above us. He was quiet for a long moment before he said, carefully, "You'd know better than me, Ren. You do this for a living. What does your gut say?" "My gut says I don't want to be right," I told him, and it was the truest thing I'd said out loud in weeks. By the following month, the unease had stopped being something I could set aside between phone calls. I noticed, at a family barbecue in my parents' backyard, that Preston had developed a habit of checking his own phone constantly, quick glances, screen angled away from the table, a too-fast thumb swipe that ended before anyone could see what he was dismissing. When Bianca asked him, lightly, who kept texting him so much, he laughed and said, "Work doesn't stop just because it's Saturday," in a tone so smooth it took me a moment to notice how quickly he'd answered, before she'd even finished the question. I noticed the speed of that answer and dismissed it as nothing, a busy attorney's reflexive defensiveness about his job. I didn't yet understand that answers arriving before questions finish being asked are their own kind of tell. Bianca herself had started wearing long sleeves regardless of the July heat, and when I hugged her goodbye that afternoon, I felt her flinch, not dramatically, just a small, involuntary contraction of the shoulder. The kind of flinch I'd cataloged in dozens of intake sessions with clients who'd learned, somewhere along the way, that touch could sometimes precede pain. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever hugged someone you love and felt their body brace instead of soften, you know exactly what that particular ache feels like, the recognition arriving in your hands before your mind is ready to let the words form. I called Dr. Owen Faraday that week, my former clinical supervisor, now a trusted mentor I still consulted when a case, personal or professional, sat too close to the bone to trust my own judgment alone. I described the pattern without naming names, the way I'd trained myself to think through a case. "Renata," he said, after listening for a long moment, "you already know what this is. You're asking me because you want someone else to say it first." He was right. I hated that he was right. That same week, my father called to ask, almost casually, if I thought Bianca and Preston were doing okay. She seemed off at the barbecue, and there was something in the careful way he phrased it that told me he'd noticed something too, and had decided. The way I had, that noticing wasn't the same thing as acting. I know some of you already see where this is going. I didn't want to. Not yet. I still believed, that week, that whatever was happening in my sister's marriage was something I could help her name gently, in my own time, without blowing apart the fragile architecture our whole family had built around Preston's image. Then, on a Thursday evening, my phone buzzed with a text, a single message, no context, from a number I didn't recognize, sent to what I would later understand was the wrong contact entirely. "Tell her it's over between us, or I will. She deserves to know before the baby comes." I stared at that message for a long time, my heart hammering hard enough that I could hear it in the quiet of my own kitchen. I didn't know yet who her was, or who the baby belonged to, or why this message had landed on my phone instead of wherever it had actually been intended. I only knew, with a cold, sudden certainty, that whatever was happening in my sister's marriage was far larger and far darker than a controlling husband confiscating a phone at dinner. I didn't ask him about it. Not yet. I told myself I needed to understand what I was looking at before I said anything that might tip him off, and some quieter, more honest part of me understood that this caution was also fear of what it would cost to be right. That night I barely slept, replaying the message over and over, trying to piece together who could have sent it and to whom it had actually been intended. The message sat in my phone for 4 days before I understood what I was looking at. I recognized, finally, on the 5th read, that the number belonged to a prefix I'd seen once before on a business card Preston had left on my parents' counter months earlier, for a woman named Talia, listed as an associate at his firm's downtown office. I hadn't thought anything of the card at the time. Now I couldn't stop thinking about it. I found that connection because of 11 years spent trained to notice exactly this kind of thread, the discipline of tracking small, discarded details until they resolve into a pattern. It was the one advantage in this entire situation that Preston never accounted for, that the sister-in-law he dismissed as sweet but soft spent her working life reading exactly the kind of manipulation he specialized in. I drove past Preston's firm's parking garage one afternoon under the pretense of a downtown lunch with Bianca, a lunch I'd engineered specifically to have an excuse to be in that part of the city, and saw his car parked beside a small gray sedan I would later learn belonged to Talia, at an hour when he'd told Bianca he was in deposition all day. I didn't confront him. I didn't tell Bianca. I drove home with my hands so tight on the wheel my knuckles ached, and sat in my driveway for 10 full minutes before I could make myself go inside and be a normal person for my own family. Monica called me again that week, this time with something more concrete. She'd overheard Preston, at a firm event Bianca hadn't attended, introducing Talia to a colleague as someone very important to me. His hand resting at the small of her back in a way Monica said made her stomach turn. Something in my chest went cold and completely still when Monica told me that, colder than anger, colder than grief. I understood, in that moment, that Preston hadn't just built one cage. He'd built two. I called Bianca that Thursday, unable to hold the information any longer, and asked her, as gently as I knew how, whether she'd ever heard the name Talia. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I counted 3 full breaths before she said, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from her, "Why are you asking me that?" I told her what I knew. Not everything. I held back the wrong number text, the parking garage, Monica's account of the firm event, but enough that she understood I wasn't guessing. She started crying quietly, the kind of crying that sounds like it's been held in for a very long time. And then, in a rush, she told me things I hadn't asked for yet, that Preston had hit her twice in the last year, both times explained away afterward as her fault, her tone, her provoking him. That she'd filed a domestic violence report 6 months earlier and withdrawn it 2 days later after Preston threatened to fight for full custody of a life they didn't even have children in yet, using his firm's resources against her. That she'd wanted to leave for 3 years and hadn't known how because he controlled every account, every password, every dollar that moved through their household. I want to be honest about the moment I almost told her everything I knew right then, all at once. The parking garage, Talia's name at the firm event, everything Monica had told me. I came right up to the edge of it. And then I pulled back because some clinical, careful part of my training understood that dumping all of it on her in one raw, unprocessed conversation would overwhelm her past the point of being able to act, and that the timing of this truth mattered as much as the truth itself. That choice cost me something. In the weeks that followed, Bianca would ask me more than once if there was something else I wasn't telling her, and I would say no, and watch a flicker of hurt cross her face at what she read as my distance rather than my restraint. I let her believe, briefly, that I was pulling away from her. It was easier than explaining why I was actually pulling everything toward a moment neither of us had reached yet. That night I made a decision. And if you've ever had to choose between comforting someone immediately and protecting the one chance you'd have to actually help them escape, you'll understand exactly why I made it. I decided to gather everything, quietly, completely, before I let a single piece of it surface where Preston could see it coming. He never knew I was watching by then, which was, I understand now, exactly the mistake that undid him. I told myself Talia was different, that she actually listened, actually cared what I thought about anything beyond billable hours and case strategy, unlike Bianca, who'd started looking at me the way you look at a bill you can't afford. I told myself the pregnancy changed nothing, that I could manage 2 lives running in parallel the way I managed everything else, carefully, on a schedule, with contingencies. I didn't let myself think about what would happen when the schedules collided. I was very good that year at not thinking about collisions. The confrontation didn't happen the way I planned it, but it happened at the moment I'd been quietly building toward for 6 weeks. My parents hosted a dinner to celebrate Preston's partner track promotion. The whole family gathered, my mother having gone all out with the good china, Julian beside me quiet and watchful, Bianca pale and careful across the table, having agreed, at my urging, to simply be present and let me handle what came next. Preston stood to make a toast, glowing with the particular confidence of a man who believed, correctly, that he had spent 8 years constructing an image no one in that room was prepared to question. "Family means everything to me," he said, raising his glass toward my parents. "Everything I have, I owe to the people who believed in me." I stood, calmly, and set my phone on the table, screen up, open to the text thread I'd finally traced completely, the wrong number message, followed by 3 weeks of messages between Preston and Talia that Monica had helped me confirm were genuine. Screenshots Talia herself had eventually sent me directly once she'd learned, from a mutual contact at the firm, that Preston had a wife. "Before you finish that toast," I said, my voice quieter than I expected it to be, steadier than I'd rehearsed, "I think everyone should see this." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply turned the phone so it faced the table and let the messages speak for themselves. Talia's due date, 6 weeks away. The $3,000 in transferred funds Preston had sent her the same week he'd bragged at Bianca's anniversary dinner about the commission bonus he'd brought home. A message from Preston to Talia dated the night of that very anniversary dinner. "Tonight was rough. Wish I was with you instead." The room went completely silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator through the kitchen doorway. "This is insane," Preston said, recovering fast, his voice sharpening into something practiced and certain. "You're going through my phone now? Is this some kind of intervention? Bianca, is this what you two cooked up?" "I never touched your phone, Preston," I said. "Talia sent me these herself, 3 days ago, once she found out you were married." His face flickered, just once, just barely, before he rebuilt the composure. This is exactly the kind of manipulation I'd expect from someone who spends her whole career convincing women their husbands are monsters. "You've always been jealous of what Bianca and I have." 6 months ago, I said, still calm, still steady, "Bianca filed a domestic violence report against you. She withdrew it 48 hours later, after you threatened to use your firm's resources to take everything from her in a divorce, including custody of children you don't even have yet." I have the case number. I have Monica's account of the firm event where you introduced Talia as someone very important to me. I have 3 years of your bruises on my sister's wrists that I convinced myself were nothing. My mother's hand had gone to her mouth. My father had gone very still, staring at Preston with an expression I'd never seen on him before. "Bianca," Preston said, turning to my sister, his voice shifting instantly into something softer, more wounded. "You don't actually believe this, do you? After everything I've done for you." "You broke my wrist in March," Bianca said, her voice shaking but clear, the first time she had ever said those words aloud to anyone but me. "You told me I fell. I let everyone believe I fell." The room seemed to tilt at that. My father made a sound I'd never heard him make before, something between a gasp and a groan. My mother, who had spent 8 years idolizing this man across every dinner table in this house, sat frozen, her wine glass trembling in her hand. "This is a setup," Preston said, louder now, standing, his voice rising toward the counterattack I'd expected from him. "You've all decided to ambush me at my own celebration dinner, based on out-of-context messages and a report Bianca herself withdrew because she knew it was overblown." "I withdrew it because you threatened me," Bianca said, standing now too, something steadying in her voice with every word. "Not because it was overblown." Monica, who Bianca had, at my suggestion, quietly invited that evening, seated near the kitchen door, watching everything, finally spoke, her voice cutting cleanly through Preston's rising volume. "I was at the Ashford Group dinner in April. I watched you introduce her to a partner as someone important to you. I have never told anyone that until right now, because I didn't know how, and I am so sorry I waited this long." Preston's composure, so carefully built across 2 decades of practiced charm, finally cracked all at once. He sat down hard, his hands pressed to his face, his breathing ragged, the room's silence closing in around him with nowhere left to perform to. He finally spoke, several minutes later, once the shouting had stopped and something rawer had taken its place. This is what he told the room. "I don't know how to explain this in a way that doesn't sound like every excuse you've ever heard, because it is one, no matter how I dress it up. It started 2 years ago. Bianca and I were fighting about money, always about whether I made enough, whether I was ever going to make partner, and I felt like nothing I did was ever going to be enough for anyone in this family, including myself. Talia started at the firm that spring. She asked me questions about my cases like she actually respected my thinking, not just my paycheck. I told myself it was harmless. Just someone who made me feel like a person worth listening to instead of a provider being graded on his output. The first time anything happened was at a work retreat, and I told myself it didn't count because it was one night, because I'd been drinking, because none of you would ever find out anyway. I believed that for about 2 weeks. Then I stopped believing it and kept going regardless, because by then I'd already crossed a line I couldn't uncross, so continuing felt like it cost nothing additional. I told myself things to survive it. That Bianca had stopped really seeing me years ago. That this wasn't really about Talia, it was about needing someone to make me feel like the version of myself I used to be before every dinner in this house turned into a referendum on my income. When Bianca got scared enough to file that report in the spring, I panicked, not because I was ashamed of hurting her, if I'm honest with all of you right now, but because I was terrified of what it would cost me professionally, socially. In every direction that mattered to the image I'd spent a decade building. I threatened her with the custody fight because it worked. It was calculated, and I knew it was calculated when I said it, and I would be lying to every one of you if I said I regretted the effectiveness of it in that moment. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I feel destroyed by what I did to Bianca, because some part of me, the part I've spent years refusing to examine, still believes I gave her a life most women would envy. And that the difficulty of being married to me was simply the cost of everything else I provided. I know how that sounds. I'm telling you anyway, because apparently I have nothing left to protect by lying about it now. Talia is having my child in 6 weeks. I don't know what happens next. For the first time since this started, I don't have an answer already prepared. The room was silent for a long moment after he finished. Nobody moved to comfort him. That's the most honest thing you've said in 8 years, Bianca finally said, quietly, and it still isn't an apology. Bianca filed for divorce 3 weeks later, this time with a lawyer Monica had recommended, someone with specific experience in cases involving coercive control and financial entrapment, someone who understood, in ways the family court system too often didn't, why a woman might withdraw a report she'd had every right to file. Preston lost his partner track position within 2 months. The firm, upon learning of the affair with a junior associate and the pattern of allegations that surfaced once Bianca's report became relevant to the divorce filing, quietly moved him off the partnership timeline entirely, and 2 of his largest clients found reasons to work with other attorneys. He lost his marriage. He lost the image he'd spent a decade constructing at every family dinner in that dining room. He lost, most visibly, my parents' unquestioning devotion, the currency he'd traded on longer than anyone in the family had realized. My mother and father sat with Bianca and me a week after that dinner, and my mother said the words I'd waited years to hear and never expected to actually get: we were wrong about him. We were wrong about how we treated Julian, too, comparing him to a man we didn't actually know. My father apologized to Julian directly, at our house, standing awkwardly in our kitchen holding a beer he didn't drink, telling him he was sorry for 8 years of measuring him against a man who'd turned out to be exactly the kind of person Julian had never pretended to be. I don't know if I fully believe every apology will hold under pressure the next time our family gathers around a table. But I believe they meant it that day, and for now, that's enough to let the door stay open a little. Talia had her daughter that spring. I never spoke to her directly beyond the messages that helped expose what was happening. Some things aren't mine to resolve. What happens between her and Preston now belongs to them. Bianca moved into a small apartment near Monica's, close enough that they see each other most weeks, far enough from the house she shared with Preston that she says the air feels different there, lighter, she told me once. Like she'd been holding her breath in that house for 8 years without realizing it. I established, finally, boundaries with my own parents I should have set years earlier: quieter dinners, less performance. A willingness on my part to name things directly instead of smoothing them over for the sake of an appearance of peace that had never actually been peace at all. Julian, for his part, built Bianca a small bookshelf for her new apartment, unprompted, the kind of quiet, steady gesture that had always said more about him than anything my parents had once dismissed him for. I think, sometimes, about the wrong number text that started all of it, a message never meant for me, landing in my hands anyway, at exactly the moment I was finally ready to stop looking away. I don't know if I'd have found my way to the truth without it. I like to think I would have. I'm honest enough with myself now to admit I'm not entirely sure. The most painful contradiction in the story isn't Preston's affair, and it isn't even the violence he inflicted and then explained away. It's the fact that a trauma therapist, trained for 11 years to recognize exactly this pattern in strangers, needed a wrong number text before she let herself see it in her own family. That's not a failure of expertise. It's a demonstration of how differently we apply what we know when the person at risk shares our last name and our childhood table. Renata's blind spot wasn't ignorance. It was the specific, familiar belief that keeping the peace protected everyone, when in fact her silence simply gave Preston 8 uninterrupted years to build his cage undisturbed. Preston's justification monologue reveals something uncomfortable about image-driven abuse. He never fully repudiated his own behavior, even in defeat. because the identity he'd built required believing he was owed devotion in exchange for provision. That's a distinct kind of unrepentance, not denial, but a worldview so entrenched that even total exposure couldn't fully dislodge it. The turning point that matters most isn't the confrontation itself. It's the moment Renata chose not to tell Bianca everything at once, understanding that timing and readiness mattered as much as truth. A choice that cost her a flicker of her sister's trust, but ultimately gave Bianca room to act rather than simply collapse under the weight of it all. And Monica's confession, carried silently for months out of uncertainty about how to raise it, is a quiet reminder that bystanders often know more than they say, not from malice, but from not knowing how to hand someone a truth that will detonate their life. Which leaves the harder question this story doesn't resolve for you. How many family dinners have to happen before someone finally says out loud what everyone at the table has already, quietly, started to suspect? If I'm honest with you, the detail that stays with me longest isn't Preston's collapse at that dinner table. It's my own mother's hand rising to her mouth, silent, disbelieving, a woman who had spent 8 years choosing comfort over the harder work of really looking at her daughter's marriage. I think about how long any of us can look directly at someone we love and still manage not to see them, simply because seeing them clearly would cost us something we're not ready to pay. I don't regret the dinner where it finally broke open. I regret the years before it, when I already had the training to name what I was looking at and chose, over and over, to look away instead. If there's someone in your life who let you down in a way you saw coming long before you let yourself admit it, or a small detail you've been quietly not looking at, tell me one word for it in the comments. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. It wasn't an easy story to finally say out loud.